Dinner in the suburban Detroit house began with the tink of a fork on a glass, the smell of grilled beef and pepper sauce still gently simmering, when Ethan, my older brother, stood up, raised his glass, his voice so excited the chandelier seemed to tremble. Everyone, I sold Grandpa's antique pocket watch for $60,000. Dinner's on me. At the word watch, a chill ran down my spine. That 1928 Hamilton was my grandfather's bequest to me, not to anyone else. Before I could even ask a question, the phone on the table buzzed sharply, the screen showing the name of a downtown law firm. I wiped a streak of sauce from my thumb and picked up. On the other end, a lawyer shouted over a cacophony, "Why did the authorities just raid our office?" The room suddenly compressed. My mother, Evelyn, hastily set down the ladle, her eyes lighting up in the way they always did whenever Ethan announced something big. Her favoritism, smoothing everything like a freshly polished tabletop. My father, Robert, adjusted his chair and cleared his throat as if to change the subject, the way he always chose when skirting the fault lines of family conflict. Maddie, the youngest, bent to rearrange the cutlery, pretending to be busy so she wouldn't be pulled into the middle. On the wall still hung a photo of our grandfather, Arthur Collins, in the little workshop out back. Shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a loop clipped to one eye, his aged hands bringing each gear back to life. He was a former watchmaker, and that Hamilton, its caseback engraved with the three letters A.C.O, was his parting injunction to me. Keep it. Use it only when you are truly ready. I looked at the empty chair at the corner of the table where he sat every holiday, then at Ethan, his smile sharp as a razor's edge. I understood that tonight wasn't just about money. It was a test of whether memory has a price, and whether a promise is mere decoration or a line that cannot be crossed. I set the phone down, switched off the ringer, kept my hand still on the wooden table to steady my racing heart. That night, I chose silence. And let the truth knock on the door for me. I grew up in the smell of machine oil mixed with old wood in the back room where my grandfather kept his watchmaking bench. He put the loop to my eye and taught me to listen to the tick, like the heartbeat of a small creature. His hand guided mine to turn the crown to wind it, then used a soft bristle brush to dust the gears. "Don't rush," he said, his voice thick as maple syrup. "What's precious isn't gold, it's memory in its right place." The day he handed me the 1928 Hamilton, the caseback freshly polished, the light reflecting in a round streak, he said to engrave three letters, A.C.O, Arthur, Collins, Olivia, so I would remember where I belong. I looked at the fine engraving, deep just enough, like a seam hidden on the wrong side, and promised to keep it until my heart said, "Ready." From then on, every Sunday morning I wound it before church, listening to the spring tense and then ease, feeling as if I were holding a piece of time you could touch. But families rarely move in step like the minute and hour hands. In my house, Ethan was always called the engine, from the way my mother praised him at dinner to the way my father set aside his paper whenever he spoke. Every stumble of his was cushioned with a reason. The market was bad. The partner was dishonest. Ethan did his best. Each time, the whole family shifted like a band changing key. My mother pivoted to defend him. My father poured more wine. Maddie changed the subject to the neighbor's cat. And I, whenever I mentioned the watch or a memory of my grandfather, was usually filed under too sensitive, clinging to the past. We Americans are used to speaking plainly, but in my house, plain talk was only allowed when praising Ethan, while anything leaning emotional got pushed into a corner and covered with a clean tablecloth. The signs before the storm came light as glasses clinking. 2 weeks before that dinner, Ethan dropped by my parents' house when I was there helping replace the porch light. He stood in the kitchen, twirling his car keys in his hand, and asked me, Lend me the safe key for a bit. I want to take photos of the watch for insurance for the whole family. He used exactly the familiar tone of someone used to being lent everything. I looked up from the still wobbling stool and asked, "Insurance for what?" "The safe is in my name." My mother, rinsing grapes under the faucet, called out as if this were self-evident. "It's our family's shared belongings, dear." I stood still for a beat, hearing clearly the water hitting the sink, and even my heartbeat slightly off. I had explained to my mother many times that my grandfather had written the keeper's name in the will, about the memory he entrusted, about the instruction, "When you are truly ready," but she always tossed it all into a big basket called family feelings and shook it until everything lost its label. I refused to hand over the key, said I would take the photos and send them. Ethan chuckled, shrugged like it was nothing. The next day, when I got back to my apartment, the wooden box holding the watch on the shelf had a brand new scratch, right on the corner of the lid. I had wiped it with a soft cloth for years, knew every old mark like I knew the way to the corner grocery. This scratch was unfamiliar, sharp as if it had just hit a metal edge. I called Ethan immediately and asked if he had stopped by our parents' place the day before after I left. He said yes, to visit Mom, then laughed it off. "You're imagining things again." I sent a photo of the scratch. Didn't accuse, just wrote, "Next time if you need to look at it, call me." He seen edit without replying. The message sat there like an envelope with no recipient, and inside me another fragility began to seep out. Colorless, odorless, leaving only a cold feeling. Late autumn in Detroit, maple leaves blanketing the path, the sky clear in a melancholy way. My parents invited the whole family to an early dinner. Said, "It's been a while since we were all together." Ethan arrived earlier than usual with a bottle of wine. Maddie brought a dessert she'd grabbed at the corner supermarket. My mother laid out the tablecloth and set the glasses that tinkled whenever someone's hand brushed them. I set out the cutlery, leaned over the chair my grandfather used to sit in, straightened the bolster my mother still kept there for warmth. In me, memories of him appeared vivid as old photos. He lifted the watch to eye level and said, "Listen, it's talking to you." Then told of the days he first arrived at the Hamilton factory, earning a meager wage but never skipping the step of wiping sweat before touching the machine. "Do whatever you want," he used to say. "Just don't let dirty hands touch things that will be passed down for generations." I had believed that as a vow. The closer it got to dinner, the more the bits of conversation tilted toward Ethan, like chairs being pulled to one end of the table. My mother asked how his work was going, so excited the stew pot boiled over and no one noticed. My father asked about the news, but listened to Ethan's answer and nodded as if the opinion had been his own. Maddie avoided everyone's eyes, busy with the neighbor's cat on her phone. I sat facing the wall clock, the second hand ticking steadily, thinking about the scratch on the wooden box, about the phrase "family's shared belongings," about the times Ethan failed and the whole house ran after to patch it with words. I saw clearly a trap made of language. When people call memory stubbornness, call boundaries selfishness, how easily everything can be turned. America teaches us to respect ownership, but in this house, ownership was redefined by a mother's sentiment and an eldest son's habits. The afternoon before, Ethan continued to text asking for the insurance photos. I had photographed every angle of the watch, set it on a white cloth the way my grandfather used to, shot the serial number and the blue hands under natural light. I sent them with a line, "Do not take it out of the house." He replied with a thumbs-up icon, nothing more. I made myself a cup of tea, set my grandfather's photo on the table, and whispered as I used to as a child, "I am keeping the promise." I thought that was that, until I saw Ethan's suit hanging in my parents' living room, the tie suspiciously new, and the way my mother kept pacing to check the food as if preparing for some big occasion beyond an ordinary dinner. All that week, the cracks showed themselves like white salt streaks on the road after a snowplow passes. Ethan changed cars, then borrowed my parents' driveway. My mother called to ask, "Do you still have the receipt for the wooden box? I want to file preservation paperwork." My father avoided talking about the watch whenever I brought it up, switching to the weekend's football game. I tried to broach the subject as gently as possible. "I'm planning to take the watch for a routine check. Can I borrow the dining room light? The natural light there is good." My mother said, "Up to you," and immediately after told Ethan to have some acquaintance evaluate it for peace of mind. The words, "for peace of mind," rolled across the table like a little marble, knocking a thin sound from every glass it hit. The evening before dinner, I stopped by my parents to set flowers on the table. I went into my father's study to get scissors and noticed a desk drawer slightly ajar. Inside was a thin envelope with the logo of a local auction house in the corner. My heart leapt to my throat. I reached out to touch it, then drew back. I didn't want to slander my own family with a glance. I set the bouquet down, stepped out to the porch for air, listened to dry grass rasp against the wooden fence. When I came back into the kitchen, Ethan was already there, the scent of new cologne wafting as if trying to replace the machine oil smell I knew from my grandfather. He put an arm around my mother, joked, "Big night tonight," then looked at me. A smile just polite enough, just challenging enough. I looked straight back, didn't smile. In America, they teach you to keep eye contact when shaking hands. In my house, looking straight had somehow become an inconvenience. When we sat down, the glasses clinked. Ethan tapped his fork against his glass and then said what he said. In that moment, I seemed to hear the wooden box lid sliding open, the safe clicking shut, someone's quick footsteps across the floor. I thought of my grandfather, of what's precious isn't gold, it's memory in its right place, of the 3 letters A.C.O engraved on the back, of Sunday mornings winding the spring. It all appeared at once, sharp as a blade. I wanted to stand up, slam my hand on the table, demand the paperwork, who gave permission, where the money went. But I didn't. I set my hand on the edge of the wooden table, took a deep breath, kept my voice in its lowest place. That night, I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because I knew all the cracks were already wide enough that a light knock would make the wall tremble. I let the truth knock on the door for me, and it did. Through the lawyers' shout over the phone, through the feet of people in the real world stepping into someone's office, through the way inflated words deflated when they hit what was real. Later, looking back, I realized the rain hadn't fallen from a clear sky. It had been gathered from little drops, starting when Ethan called a memory a financial plan, when my mother called a keepsake family property, when the scratch on the wooden box was passed off as an unnamed accident, when an auction house envelope lay still in an unlocked drawer. I had passed each sign like passing a row of highway signs, each sign a letter, until the final stretch spelled a word I didn't want to read. But even so, I still had the right to choose how to pull over. Not plow into the fence, not crash into the pole, just brake, signal, pull to the shoulder, and wait for the right person to appear. On that dinner night, the right people did appear. Not in my family, but on the other end of the phone, at the proper authorities, in places that put rules above sentiment. And I, for the first time in many years, put loyalty back where it belonged, in the promise to a man who taught me to hear the tick like hearing myself breathe. The cracks I had seen over the past few weeks flowed into a single point like rainwater meeting at the bottom of a gutter, and that very evening, right amid the delicate clink of fork against glass, the gutter overflowed, not with shouting, but with a seemingly harmless boast of achievement. Ethan stood at the head of the table, a glass of red wine in hand, speaking clearly as if reading a speech. Letting dead antiques sit around is a waste. Getting a good price is what shows you truly value them. Tonight's dinner comes from that. He stressed good price with a smirk, as if he had just closed the deal of his life. My mother clapped first. Aunts and uncles in the family joined in. The tink of glasses ran along the table. Maddie snapped a quick photo, slapped on a family time sticker for the sake of social media ritual. I sat motionless, feeling like a snail drained of water, hollow but heavy. No one asked, "Where is the ownership?" No one remembered that the Hamilton engraved with the 3 letters A.C.O. was my grandfather's bequest to me, that it was not family property for anyone to grab at will. Ethan went on. Turning something old into money is talent, right? He looked toward our mother and received a satisfied nod. I looked at our grandfather's chair still empty as on every holiday, and heard the wall clock tick each second as if scratching straight into bone. My phone buzzed on the table, screen face down. I flipped it. An unknown number with a law firm's name. I glanced at Ethan. He was still talking about how the buyer is a renowned collector, and his friend's auction network is very reputable. Then answered. On the other end was a man trying to stay calm but unable to hide the panic. Why did the authorities just raid our office? They're saying the estate asset is encumbered. The transaction shows signs of being void. The chaotic noise behind him, the rustle of papers, someone asking, "Is there a warrant?" The thud of shoes on wooden floors crashed into my ear like cold waves. I stood, stepped away from the table, pressed my palm to the window for coolness. "Perhaps you have the wrong number," I said quietly. "I'm Olivia Collins." "We're calling the right person," he said urgently. "Your name is in the related file. The investigators request that we keep contact with you. The watch is an estate asset listed under your name. Is that correct?" I closed my eyes for one beat. The image of the will rose up like the paper I had once touched. My grandfather Arthur's rough handwriting, properly notarized. The Hamilton 1928 line clearly stating, "To be given to granddaughter Olivia Collins until she voluntarily transfers it." I had kept the watch in the family safe while renovating my place. The key in my possession. The code changed by me. I had been careful at every step, except for the one I hadn't foreseen. Family slipping through a crack I thought no one would dare step through. I hung up before I could breathe when a second message appeared. Unknown number. No name. Investigator. Keep things normal. Don't alarm anyone. We are on our way. 3 sentences, each like a stepping stone laid across a freezing river. I read it again, then restrained my hand from instinctively staring at Ethan. I inhaled, counted silently to 4, exhaled slowly. In America, we're taught to keep calm when something big happens. Verify information, record, preserve evidence. I switched my phone to silent, slipped it back into my coat pocket, smoothed the edge of the tablecloth. My mother called out, "Who is that, dear?" I turned back and gave a thin smile. "Wrong number." "Mom." My father glanced at me, his eyes seeming to say, "Don't fan the flames." I nodded slightly, as if sending a private signal. "I'm not fanning them. The storm is coming on its own." Ethan was still there, continuing his story about how the buyer was captivated by the original wooden box, tight lock, dial still bright, as if he were the one who had polished every corner and cleaned every gear. He flaunted the money like a sports victory. $60,000. Quick, clean deal, not a cent off. Relatives murmured. Someone asked if he felt any regret. He laughed. What's there to regret about something that's sat in a safe for decades? My mother chimed in. Antiques kept forever only collect dust. I saw Maddie steal a glance at me, then drop her eyes to her salad. The scene felt like a family play performed on cue. The eldest son stepping onto the stage, the mother as MC, the father as keeper of order, the youngest as background. And I, the one holding the main prop, assigned the role of overly sensitive, best kept silent. I returned to my chair, back straight, hands on my thighs. The sound of wine being poured, forks tapping plates, the casserole set down on the table. It all felt like a soundtrack covering the approaching footsteps of the outsiders I knew were about to knock. I unfolded the napkin onto my lap, touched the fabric's edge with my fingertips, reminding myself to keep my movements ordinary. In the kitchen, the oven pinged its temperature. The sweet scent of pumpkin pie spread. I looked at my grandfather's empty chair and thought of how he placed each screw into a little tray, carefully labeled. He used to say, "When you put the right name on a thing, it scares you less." I whispered in my head, "Theft, abuse of trust, unlawful sale." Those words sat still like 3 nails, sharp, straight, and correct. The doorbell rang, not loud, soft, polite, like the Amazon delivery person. My mother went to answer. Ethan readied a welcome smile. I heard someone say my name clearly. No need to raise their voice. My father started, set down his glass, the crystal giving a slight shiver on wood. Ethan turned to me, surprise flickering across his face before he recovered quickly. "Must be a misunderstanding." I didn't answer. Stillness doesn't mean surrender. It's the posture of someone who has laid all the pieces on the table, ready for those with authority to see. The minutes that followed passed like a slow-motion reel. My mother asked if we needed the family lawyer. A deep male voice said, "We've already contacted one." Ethan began talking more than usual, explaining about a financial idea, about family benefit, about antiques not generating returns. I listened to each word like counting the footsteps across the living room's wooden floor toward the safe set in the wall. Someone asked who held the key. My mother answered, "It's the house safe, shared." I spoke for the first time since dinner began. It was my grandfather's, entrusted to me. No raised voice, no embellishment. Just like my grandfather taught me when tightening a screw, stop when it's just right. Don't force it and strip the threads. Someone asked to see the documents. My father silently went to fetch the file. I watched his hand tremble as he slid out the plastic cover and took out the will. The 3 letters A.C.O seemed to glow before my eyes, even though no one opened the silver back. Ethan produced appraisals, auction terms, but all of it orbited a void. Not a single word indicated he had the right to sell. He said, "She left it in the house safe, so it's family property?" The person across from him replied evenly, "It is not." I heard that "it is not" ring steady like the minute hand clicking past the 12. A text in my pocket buzzed softly once. "Everything is proceeding properly. Please continue dinner." I swallowed a sip of water and, for the first time since Ethan tapped his fork on the glass, felt my taste return. I took a bite of mashed potatoes, chewed slowly, eyes fixed on the scene before me. My mother began to lower the temperature, her voice smaller, saying, "If that's the case, how do we set this right?" My father sighed, leaned back in his chair. Maddie sat still, her fingers twisting a cheap silver ring as if to steady herself. Ethan, the one just applauded for his achievement, was suddenly forced to answer questions no one at home had taught him since childhood. "How did you take it? Who gave permission? How do you understand the concept of inheritance?" He faltered a beat, then swung into blame. "Olivia left it in the house safe. If you wanted to keep it, why didn't you take it somewhere else? I looked straight at him. Because I trusted this house. The 4 words fell onto the table, heavy as the final screw set into the right tray. Dinner went quiet, but not with the usual collusion. It was the silence of people compelled to hear their own breathing, to touch the paperwork, to speak less so as not to speak wrong. I returned to my chair, sat upright, and let Ethan keep the spotlight he had seized. He took a sip of wine, tried to smile, the next sentence sticking on his lips. I didn't rescue him this time. I didn't smooth things over for peace. I didn't untangle the knots he had tied around his own wrists. I only set my hand on the table, my thumb touching the knuckle of my index finger, a familiar feeling like turning a crown to wind. Firm, steady, and without tremor. At the end of the meal, my mother brought out dessert that no one bothered to cut. I looked at the tip of the knife lying still beside the pumpkin pie, its blade catching a thin line of light. I thought of my grandfather, of that tiny glimmer slipping through the case of the watch when he held it up to the lamp. He used to say, "You don't need to shout. You only need to do what's right." That night, I did what was right, by not stepping into the truth's path, letting it knock on its own, walk in, and call everything by its proper name. Ethan remained at the head of the table, basking in a hollow glory like a soap bubble flown too far, and I, silent, watched, certain that from this moment on the story was no longer about oversensitivity or clinging to memory. It was about the law, the will, the instructions of a man who taught me that the most precious thing isn't gold. It's memory in its rightful place. And tonight, that memory was put back in place, right in the middle of a kitchen smelling of butter and garlic, among crystal glasses that had stopped clinking. The clinking of crystal had barely faded, and laughter still hung in the air when Ethan slid his chair back with a soft scrape, leaned over, and took a stack of papers from his briefcase. The unhurried gesture of someone convinced he'd locked the story down with words. I sat still, back straight, to see how many beats the truth he'd prepared would stand before that door knocked again. Ethan spread the papers in the middle of the dining table, pinning each corner with something at hand. A salt shaker, a pepper shaker, an empty stem, like a makeshift desk. "Sales contract," he said, voice striving for calm but excitement leaking at the tail end. "My signature is here." He pointed to a line of blue ink, flicking the pen tip like a teacher underlining what needs circling. I looked down. The chandelier cast a golden streak across the page. The name Olivia Collins appeared on the copy, the O gaping open like a door ajar, the final stroke of the S sliding off the margin. I felt my fingertips go cold. Since I was 13, when my grandfather taught me to sign my name in my first notebook, I have always closed the O in a neat circle, tight and continuous, as he taught. Close it so nothing leaks. The version on the table was open, clumsy to the point of blatant. Ethan went on, dropping his lines like traps. "I didn't hire a broker, saved fees for the family. I closed it myself. Quick, clean, maximum profit." My mother nodded by reflex, eyes lighting at the phrase, "saved fees," as always when she heard Ethan tack, "optimize," onto anything. I looked up and met my mother's eyes. She leaned in and whispered like an usher keeping order in church, "That thing belongs to our family." I answered slowly, letting each word set down on the table like evenly placed pebbles. "It belongs to Grandpa's promise to me." She paused a beat, lips pressed tight. At her neck, the green jade necklace, the one she wore whenever she wanted to look steadfast, trembled slightly with her breath. My father set his broad hand flat on the table, knuckles whitening, eyes fixed on the space between the papers, as if a line of text there might save things. Maddie pulled her chair closer, half her body tucked behind the backrest, fingers edging along the wood as if searching for something to grip. A knock at the door, not loud but weighty, split Ethan's optimize in two. My mother sprang up, smoothing her blouse hem with a palm, an unconscious gesture before meeting important guests. Footsteps sounded on the wood floor, heavy, even, drawing closer. The door opened. Two men and a woman in plain clothes, dark coats, stepped in and showed their badges. Their voices were neither harsh nor soft. "We're with the Civil Investigations Unit. We need to preserve a scene related to a potentially improper transaction of an estate asset. Please leave all documents and phones where they are." My mother froze, hand on her necklace. My father blinked rapidly. Ethan forced a thin smile and jutted his chin toward the stack. "We're having a family dinner." The woman nodded, her tone still even. "We'll be as swift as we can and respectful of your space, but certain questions must be answered now." They laid a small piece of backing board on the table, set down a recorder, and marked Ethan's pages with temporary yellow stickers. First, the salt and pepper-haired man looked at Ethan. "State the sequence of events." Ethan inhaled, his voice switching to professional. "This is a family asset. I optimized finances by selling an unused antique that generated no returns. I had a buyer ready. The transaction was transparent. Funds have cleared." "Do you have a power of attorney from the owner?" came the immediate, clipped question. Ethan arched a brow. "It's our house," he repeated. "Shared property." The investigator turned his gaze to me. "Ms. Olivia Collins?" I nodded. "Please provide any documents proving your related rights." I did not interrupt Ethan. Didn't wedge in a word. I opened my bag, took out the plastic file I'd set aside when the text arrived, unzipped it, and slid out the notarized will. I opened to the exact page with the line, "Hamilton 1928, bequeathed to granddaughter Olivia Collins until she voluntarily transfers it." I placed beside it a photo of the watch's interior taken in natural light. The three letters A.C.O cleanly and deeply engraved. I didn't need to explain. Ink, paper, and metal did the rest. The room's temperature shifted suddenly, as if someone had opened a freezer door. The female investigator bent close, scrutinized the handwriting, then looked up. "Is this certified?" "Yes." I pointed to the red seal. "My grandfather drafted it. Our family lawyer holds one copy. I hold this one." Ethan cut in. "But she kept it in the house safe." "The safe is shared." The salt and pepper man frowned. "Do you have a key?" Ethan gave a derisive little laugh. "I borrowed it." The word borrowed fell light but landed loud. My father shifted in his chair, face going ashen. My mother avoided my eyes, twisting the necklace until a red mark rose on her skin. Maddie looked at him, then at me, eyes round as if she had never imagined the script in her head could be rewritten so fast. One investigator's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and looked up. "We'll bring the buyer on video to clarify good faith and process." He set the phone on the backing board. A middle-aged man's face appeared, with a white office wall behind him. "We purchased according to procedure," he said, trying to stay calm. "We were unaware of any internal dispute." A man claiming to represent the family had appraisal documents and a transfer signature. "We paid according to the terms." "Did you verify ownership?" the woman asked. "A photocopy of the will?" The buyer stalled. "No. We trusted the seller because the timeline was tight and a referral." The camera trembled slightly as he exhaled. "If there's an issue, we're willing to cooperate." Ethan hitched his shoulder, trying to assemble another narrative. Olivia agreed. She signed. The signature is there. He pointed at the blue ink, daring anyone with untrained eyes. I looked straight at him and said even, I did not sign, and if you forged it, you know the first thing I'd point out is the open O. The investigator flipped another sheet, a sloppy authorization letter, and asked Ethan, "Who drafted this?" "A friend," Ethan said. "An attorney?" "No," he blurted, "but good with paperwork." The salt and pepper man tipped his jaw, the kind of nod that isn't pleased. "We'll need the original, your friend's identity, all emails and messages. From now on, do not delete anything." He angled slightly toward me. "Do you have any other documents?" I shook my head. "Just these, and the wooden box. It's not at my apartment." He turned to my mother. "The safe is in this house?" She gave the slightest nod, lips white from pressing. "Please lead the way. We need to seal it." They stood. Footsteps crossed the wood floor into the hall, stopping before the built-in cupboard. My father followed, hands shaking so the keys clinked. I stayed at the kitchen threshold, not moving. In the dining room, Maddie gathered the remaining papers into a neat corner. A reflex to make the mess a little less. Ethan still sat, hand half covering his mouth, eyes darting as if searching for a foothold. He turned to me, whispering like a plea. "What do you want? To make me lose face in front of everyone?" I answered, just loud enough for him. "I want to put everything back in its proper place." He curled his lip. "Its proper place. Being yours." I shook my head. "Grandpa's." Those two words slid through thin paper like a sharp blade, cutting clean through an assumption he'd carried for years. The safe opening sounded, the lock's tumblers falling into their grooves, crisp enough to chill. A moment later, the investigator returned with a clear evidence bag in hand. Inside it, the dark wooden box I'd known since childhood. They didn't open it, only sealed, labeled the time, and noted witnesses' names. The woman asked softly, "Who last opened the safe before today?" My mother swallowed. "I did." "Why?" "Tidying the house." She didn't look at me as she spoke. I hid my hand in the napkin and closed my eyes for a beat to tamp down the burn rising in my throat. In that instant, my grandfather's image came clean, sorting screws into trays, adjusting his loop, teaching me patience. I opened my eyes, looked around, and let the anger pass like cold air slipping through a door crack. Acknowledge it. Don't resist it. The confrontation continued right at the table. The investigator set the recorder amid plates of food cooling by the minute, enunciating slowly for the tape. "We will record the sequence of events. Each person answers for what they know, without speaking over others." Ethan recited optimization idea, shared property, family benefit, like a memorized lesson. This time, no one applauded. My father sat motionless, staring at the pumpkin pie plate as if watching long enough would cool everything down. My mother twisted the beads, the jade clicking dryly. When it was my turn, I simply slid the will in the A.C.O photo forward and said exactly 3 things. Grandpa left it to me. I did not sign. I did not authorize. The buyer on the screen hedged. "We're prepared to return funds if the transaction is deemed void. Please don't publicize our identity." The investigator nodded. "That is a procedural matter. For now, the funds will be temporarily frozen." No one ate anymore. Relatives rose one by one, someone citing the kids, someone saying they had to run. The kitchen, warm from the oven, felt as cold as a hospital waiting room. Ethan gathered his contract back up, his hands more awkward than when he laid it out. He stuffed it into his bag, yanked the zipper so hard it caught. My mother meant to say something, but it dissolved into a sigh. My father wiped the rim of a glass that was already clean, repeating the motion as if to keep his hands busy. Maddie came to my side and touched my elbow lightly without speaking. We stood like that for a few seconds, long enough to hear the wall clock tick one more notch. When the authorities left, they set down 3 report sheets on the table, a few stray yellow stickers, and a void that would be hard to fill. The female investigator looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you for staying calm." I nodded, didn't smile, just said, "Yes." The door closed. Footsteps receded down the porch. Ethan braced his hands on the table and looked at me as if hoping to find an escape route in my eyes. I didn't give one. Not out of cruelty, because tonight, every route had already been called by its name: forgery, boundary violation, sale of property not yours to sell. I sat down, drew my chair in, lifted the napkin from my lap, and laid it neatly on the table. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence that once shielded my brother. It was the silence of a clock after its beat has been set right, clear, even, and needing no applause. When the wooden box was sealed and the door closed behind the authorities, my kitchen felt so empty I could hear the wall clock's hand advancing. I thought that dinner had been the ending point, but it turned out to be only the first page of a ledger of consequences, each page turning with a creak, like long dried wood. The first news came in on Monday morning. The law office that prepared the transfer documents for Ethan was temporarily suspended to facilitate investigation. In Detroit, that doesn't play out loudly like in the movies. An internal email leaks, a hastily taped office closed sign goes up, a few clients with appointments turn away. Almost simultaneously, the title company that took part in certifying the transaction had its license temporarily suspended by regulators, not because they intentionally abetted it, but because they skipped the most basic step: verifying the owner of the estate asset. The broker Ethan bragged about as knowing the auction circuit had a separate file opened. The person in charge of process oversight called it an expensive lesson. No connections substitute for verification. I read the news, took a sip of coffee, and felt a coolness run down my back. Not satisfaction, just clarity. In a society that prizes process like America, shortcuts rarely take you farther. They only get you to the courtroom door faster. Then social media played its part, as it does. The photo my mother posted the previous weekend, her standing next to Ethan, hand on his shoulder, captioned, "My son closed the deal of the century," suddenly became proof of intent. Investigators printed it out, marked the timestamp, and cross-referenced it with the flow of funds. My mother deleted the photo right after that dinner, but the internet did not delete with her. I looked at the still that remained in the case file. My mother's smile slightly shaky, the green jade necklace on her neck glinting, and felt a very American sadness. Sometimes a harmless brag about one's child turns into an arrow flying back, because it steps over a clear legal boundary that the adults in the house chose not to see. From the watch, the thread pulled out another tangle, the shared money trickling for years, moving from a family account to places no one monitored. The investigation surfaced the name Noah E. Collins in several documents, Noah being Ethan's legal name, Ethan only a nickname, and under that name were withdrawals for event expenses, broker fees without invoices, regular transfers to someone named Sloan with unpleasant notes. Marker. Settle. I remembered a night long ago when my mother half joked, half meant it. Sell the necklace and get on with business. I'd thought then she was sniping about the family fund. Now, sell the necklace appeared on paper as a plan once considered, abandoned for lack of someone to hold title. They pieced it together like reassembling an old watch. The scratch on the wooden box, the borrowed safe key, the auction house envelope, the Facebook post, the transfers to Sloan. all meshing too neatly, needing only a tap to start running. On the court day, the courtroom was as cold as an office before the heat is turned on. Ethan, listed legally as Noah, stood at the lectern, shoulders slumped, tie cinched so tight his neck flushed red. Sloane sat in the row behind, hair tied back, face blank. The defense attorney spoke at length about financial pressure, intentions for the family, ignorance of estate law, while the prosecutor read the chain of evidence smoothly. Forged signature, interference with property specifically bequeathed, transferring assets through unverified intermediaries, using funds for gambling. When it was the judge's turn, he did not speak loudly, but each word landed like a stone set on a foundation. You did not optimize an asset. You wrote the script for a crime. That sentence drew a line of white chalk across the room. The sentence pronounced was concise yet long. 4 federal years for Noah, with restitution, repayment of damages. Sloane received probation for a lesser accomplice role and cooperation with investigators. My parents were ordered to return any indirect benefits, if any, because they had used money from the improper transaction. My mother sat on the bench, hands clenched white. My father bowed his head over the court calendar, as if staring long enough at the boxes of dates could rewind time. In tandem with the sentence was the journey of returning things to their proper place. After examination, the Hamilton watch was returned to its lawful owner, me, along with a detailed conservation report. The silver case should be wiped with a neutral solution. The third gear should be oiled with a light grade every 12 months. The title company's insurance, for professional error, agreed to fund all conservation costs for 3 years as a form of redress. Not only the watch, the jade necklace, a piece my grandmother left me in a will addendum I'd long kept in the same file, was also reappraised because it showed signs of having been borrowed beyond the permitted period by the family. Conclusion: ownership belonged to me. The necklace had only been temporarily worn, with no transfer document. On the day I received it back, I took the small red box from the specialist's hands, feeling as light as having drawn the last stitch through the right eye of a needle. A few weeks later, the local museum sent an invitation. They wanted to mount a special exhibit: Heirloom and Integrity, Family Treasures and Integrity, displaying family inheritances that had passed through legal and ethical trials. They requested to borrow the Hamilton with conditions for insurance, display case temperature, and a rotation schedule for the piece. I read the letter and felt a very American gentleness. Even old things are given time off. The story spread in its own way, not loudly, but steadily. An art school invited me to speak to students about boundaries and memory. Several cultural organizations wrote asking if I could help them rebuild artifacts and events management procedures. One place proposed a specific role: lead of operations, fronting openings, art weeks, charity auctions, the sort of thing that, in the past, I would have accepted immediately and then worked myself to exhaustion. This time, I scheduled meetings and brought a sheet like the white picket gate I closed in Honolulu. Clear working hours, no pings after 8 p.m., unless pre-agreed. Runbook locked by T72 hours. Credit goes to the person who did the work. Postmortems with limits and fees. The right to stop when boundaries are breached. They read, nodded, and added a line that warmed me. Team first does not mean self last. I signed, not to forget the past, but to let the past stay still in its proper place, like an old photo hanging on a necessary wall. For the family, the consequences were not just the sentence. They were the quiet dinners where no one dared tap a fork on a glass, the way my mother looked at the jade necklace without putting it on, the way my father walked more slowly each time he passed the built-in safe door. Maddie came to my place on a Saturday afternoon, bringing a box of pastries, and said softly, "I'm sorry I stayed silent too long." I poured tea and didn't ask for justification. In this country, people gradually learn to say, "I was wrong," without degrading themselves. We sat on the floor, opened the pastry box, shared just enough silence, then talked about small things. The patch of garden where my mother replanted flowers, the notebook my grandfather left with a few machine cleaning formulas, the photo of him with a loop that everyone remembers. As for Ethan, or Noah, he sent me a letter from federal prison. Pale yellow paper, hurried handwriting. He said he wanted to do right by the family but lost his way. Asked me not to display the watch like a scar. I read it, folded it, and set it next to my grandfather's notebook. I don't hate him, nor am I the final judge. I only keep my proper role, the timekeeper. On the exhibit's opening day at the museum, I stood a step behind the velvet rope, looking at the Hamilton resting in the case, the hands ticking steadily, the small label below reading, Hamilton 1928, property of the Collins family, Olivia Branch, and a short note, on loan from a private collection. I didn't need my name in large letters, I only needed that word loan to remind everyone that whether things stay or go, there must be a word, a limit, a clear commitment. Leaving the museum, Detroit's air was crisp. Maple leaves swirled across the road. I patted my coat pocket. My new staff badge from the cultural organization clicked with a steady clack. That evening, I went home, opened my own safe, and placed the jade necklace on a labeled tray, next to my grandfather's watch. I closed the safe and noted the date and time, as he had taught me. Then I sat at the table, opened my work calendar, and added to Monday's box. Call the museum about the display rest schedule, and remind team first, self last. I brewed a pot of tea, sat listening to the small clock in the living room tick steadily, imagining my grandfather smiling lightly. Close the loop cleanly and you can move on. The consequences have spread and will smolder for a while, but there are things I have returned to their proper place. The objects, the boundaries, and the way I deal with the world. The rest, the lessons for those who take shortcuts, the sentences hanging over carelessness, do not belong to me. They belong to the law, to the notices taped to office doors, to the licenses revoked, and to the people who will have to start over. As for me, I switch on the porch light like every house in the neighborhood does each night, letting its small gold glow fall on the clean step, a kind of peace, with a lock, a name, and a rhythm. The Detroit night was crisp. I stood before the glass case in the new gallery, slowing my breath the way I used to when winding the Hamilton as a child. All the noise had receded until only my heartbeat and the steady ticking remained. That was when I knew the story had closed on its proper page. I placed the necklace into the specialist's hands, signed the loan receipt for the artifact, then stepped back half a pace to watch the light fall on the deep sapphire face, clear as a winter sky after the first snow. My palm brushed the edge of the glass and I recalled his voice. Keep your promise to what you cherish. It turns out heirlooms aren't just gold or numbers. They are the discipline of filing papers neatly, the memory set in its right place, the honor that isn't bargained. Boundaries are not high walls to distance yourself from family. They are the white fence around your garden, so things can grow without being trampled by slick rationalizations. And I learned one more thing. Silence, in the right place at the right time, is sometimes stronger than any argument, especially when the truth needs a clean path to enter. That night, I didn't retaliate. I answered with law and calm, returning things to their rightful owner, putting names back on the right line, letting my heart keep its proper rhythm. Thank you for coming with me to the final page of this story. If you've ever had family put a price on what cannot be priced, a keepsake, a memory, a boundary, share one small detail in the comments so those who are lonely know they are not alone. If you think this story is worth keeping, please like and subscribe so the algorithm doesn't miss the next part. We will meet again on calmer pages.